This is Dan Schneider, and on this Dan Schneider video interview, I will be talking with a man named Tom Sunic about the life and career and ideas of Oswald Spengler, a noted historian, and that will be occurring in just a moment. Well, as I mentioned, this show I will be talking with an expert on the life of Oswald Spengler, a noted historian of almost a century ago. His name is Tom Sunic, and you see him on your screen. And so, welcome, Tom.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for your invitation. I appreciate being here, and I'm at your service.
Well, I wanted to talk, as I said, a little bit about Oswald Spengler, but before we get into sort of a background about his life and ideas just for this first segment, I'd like you to just talk a little bit about who you are. Are you a historian? Are you a researcher? What books you have, and what your interest in Oswald Spengler is. So if you could give us a little bit, 3, 4, 5 minutes background on yourself.
Well, first and foremost, I'm a U.S. citizen, but I was born in Croatia, rather in ex-communist Yugoslavia, so I have a communist experience in my mindset as well, and a capitalist experience of the United States of America and Western Europe, where I also studied. So this certainly facilitates my understanding of Oswald Spengler, who was critical of both liberalism, or let's put it bluntly, of capitalism, and of communism. And I in my undergraduate work here back in communist Yugoslavia, I studied foreign languages and literature in Europe, in Western Europe, in France for some times as well. And then I moved to the United States of America, where I obtained political asylum based on the fact that my old man, my dad, was a lawyer, a Catholic lawyer in communist Yugoslavia, who was arrested for his very politically incorrect beliefs. He was a prominent adversary of the communist system back during the Cold War. It's a pretty long story as far as my dad is concerned. So anyway, he's already dead a long time ago. So in the United States of America, I obtained my PhD at the University of California in political science. Now, having said this, I must say I don't like using this word expert because there is something self-serving about this word. I just consider myself an avid reader, an avid truth seeker, to some extent also a heretic, a dissident, if you wish. And I certainly I'm always open to different intellectual challenges. And I like reading, and I certainly am very much focused on literature. So I feel comfortable talking about Spengler just as much as I feel comfortable talking about Greek classics like Sophocles or others. And I've been dealing with different sorts of subjects and topics, and I'm frequently a guest speaker at different places in Europe, in the United States of America, and I'm ruling out that I may be relocating soon back to the States and starting or restarting or rejumping again my teaching career because I miss my students. Yes, I need to tell you that. There was a little parenthesis I needed to add. One of the reasons I came here to Yugoslavia, I left Yugoslavia, but then I returned back to Croatia because I was pretty much active as a diplomat in a Croatian Foreign Service and as a diplomat. So I was stationed in Belgium, in Copenhagen, and also in Algiers for a while. So it certainly gave me an additional perspective of this human drama that we call that to some extent, if you look the portion of it in the West, we call it the decline of the West. And I guess that's much about this. I guess my books speak better than I, as far as I'm concerned. So feel free to look at my prose. I guess everybody has his ID, just like you do, and some of your listeners. And I guess I'm proud to say that my ID are my books published in the English and German and the French languages.
Well, just so people know who are watching this, below this video, you will see a link to Tom's website. It's tomsunic.com. So you'll be able to look over his website, and he has essays and writings in multiple languages. So thanks. Uh, let me uh, let me talk a bit about Oswald Spengler then. Well, let's talk. What actually drew you to his work, his outlook? As a layman myself, when I got out of high school back 30 years or so ago, I know I read Decline of the West, and it was for me a very interesting book, and I've always felt that it was very misrepresented. Spengler often gets lumped in with Nietzsche as a sort of proto-Nazi, and I don't recall. And again, it's been 30 some years since I read the book in full, but I never really found his ideas to be that repugnant or anything. But he seems to have always been a tard with a bad reputation by other people, you know, in history, historians and whatnot. Um, what drew you to Spengler, and what kind of myths can you maybe dispel about his reputation as a thinker?
Sure. Well, it's a huge topic. Well, let me start from what you just said a while ago. I'm very keen as a linguist to some extent. I'm very keen about the right meaning of words. And I'm almost obsessed, I could put it that way, with semantic distortions. And this is the better expression. So when you say that, when some people say, when some folks argue that Spengler was a proto-Nazi or something, this is a wrong wording to start with. Actually, he was very much opposed to National Socialism. And secondly, and I guess I could spend an hour just talking about this derivative, this word derivative, National Socialism. I guess that's a better word than Nazism. We have to know exactly what that means and what that meant during his epoch. Oswald Spengler died in 1936. There is no question he had a meeting with actually Hitler in 1933, called him for a private discussion, because there is no question that the National Socialist authorities, I'm talking specifically about cultural academic authorities, wanted to enlist and actually harness to some extent his intellectual prestige, or Spengler's prestige, into their own ideological bandwagon. Well, he was probably lucky because he died a couple of years later. In 1936, he died. Now, as far as, I'm very keen, again, I must say, about those name throwing. And he was definitely a sympathizer. He was, to some extent, a fan of Mussolini, but he rejected National Socialism, and even many leftists, or whatever that means, or many liberal scholars do hold him in high esteem. Those who don't, those who actually um, tamper with his name are usually those who haven't read anything by him, or who probably just read some short summaries and synopses on his life. Now, again, this is like an introductory form. Let me now start with the basics, if I may. I must say, I guess, on an explanatory level, we read, and I'm sure Dan, you read the stuff. We have to read the stuff, either the one that is dished out to us that we have to read. This is a mandatory reading, like in our high school. We have on the reading list the books that you simply have to read. But there are also certain books that you feel sort of, you have an inclination, you have a penchant, you have a certain hidden interest for some of the authors. And of course, I must say, when I was a boy, when I was in high school, and even later on here in communist Yugoslavia, I barely knew who Oswald Spengler was. Well, his books were translated. They had been translated a long time ago, back in the old Yugoslavia in the early 20s. But he was simply not on the reading list. He was not a guy worth any PR attention at that epoch, at that time. And neither was he very popular in a Federal Republic of Germany, nor was he popular in the United States of America in the 50s, 60s, or 70s, other than in some quote-unquote conservative circles. I must make another digression. Why do I use the word quote-unquote or alleged? Why do I use the adjective would be or purported or what have you? Simply because I'm scared of those words. I'm scared that at the same time I despise some of those words. I don't like name calling. I don't like calling people names they don't deserve. So probably the name Oswald Spengler deserves is cultural pessimist. This is probably the word that the best expression that fits um, describes Spengler best. Now back to my interest for Spengler. I actually developed interest for Spengler when I was in my late 20s. when I was able enough to read the German, his German text in the original. And I'm proud of it, of course, because it's an entirely different ballgame when you read Oswald Spengler in the English translation, which is very good, by the by, and also the French translation is very good. But it's an entirely different rhapsody, blue rhapsody, when you read Spengler in its original, because of the richness of the German language and so on. And again, I think I need to spend some time just explaining the title of this book that we all read. I presume, Dan, you also read the book when you were much younger,
Yeah.
the Decline of the West. First, the Untergang is the right German word that was translated into English by the decline. Now, the Untergang in the German language, and sorry to bother you with that, but it's quite important. It's not exactly the right replica, the English replica of the German word der Untergang. Der Untergang means like a decay, something falling apart. It's not just like the decline. Decline is a process, like the Untergang is almost the finished process. So I guess there's a slight difference in time frame. So I prefer this, the Untergang. It sounds, it has a certain tonality, it has a certain rhythm, but at the same time, it has a somewhat nuanced significance, which is certainly different than the English significance to decline.
Well, Tom, let me just ask you: would an English word like aftermath be more applicable? Do you think? Because as I recall, and just in looking up some notes, it always seemed to me that Spengler was not so much mourning things, but looking ahead towards a new world, and so he was sort of looking back, from as if that had already passed in a sense, or was about to pass. So would aftermath, do you think, have been a better word choice?
I don't quite think so. Let me tell you why. The Untergang, if I can just metaphorically explain it, the Untergang in the German language, the German title, is something past. It's a past tense. It's finished past tense. Whereas the decline, in my understanding, when you use the word decline, décliner, the French have décliner, when you declinate the words, the nouns, it is rather a process which is still with us, which is a past perfect tense. So if I were to choose a better translation of his major book, the Decline of the West, I would probably prefer the word. It's a good point, indeed. I've been thinking about this for years. The decay might be good, but I'm trying to figure out a process, a verbal, a noun which describes a past process of decay, and which is no longer retrievable, which can no longer be resuscitated back to life. This is exactly what the Untergang means: something which is finished, over, the decay, the end of the world, but cannot be resuscitated. Unlike what you just said, the aftermath. The aftermath means rather something that happens after.
How about petrification?
Well, thank you. That sounds much better. Of course, this may be a little bit, Petrus. It comes from the Latin word the stone, petrification, to petrify, the stone, stonification, getting stoned. I don't want to off, Anyway, getting stoned with a pet, but that petrification might be a better thing. The petrification. He talks about the petrified cultures when he talks about ancient cultures in the Middle East. He talks about as well. We have Persepolis, for instance, which he mentions. Then we have also, what's the name of the town? It was seized recently by the terrorists, the ISIS, Petra, that's in Jordan. Anyway, it just crossed my mind. I got lots of things coming into my mind in different languages. So anyway, once again, the decline is a good, it's a valid, it's an acceptable, feasible translation. But I'm still trying to think about something along the lines of the petrification of culture, as you then very well put. Now, this is not the end of the story. Hopefully, I'm not bothering you younger listeners. I would advise them, and I would certainly strongly urge them, if they have their professors, regardless whether they're undergraduate studies or graduate studies, please, folks, challenge your professor. Ask them. Ask them always who defines those words, be it in the justice and legal system, be it in sociology or political science or whatever you study. Just make sure you understand the right meaning of the word in its right time span, in its right epoch, because otherwise, folks, we get into just beating around the bush.
Well, Tom,
Now,
Tom, into the book a little bit more in our next segment. If you can you give me a few minutes of just background about Spengler, where he came from, what part of Europe, the social background that he came from, the time that he appeared, and what may have formed his views.
all right. Now he was born in the late. He was born at the end of the 19th century. And guys, keep in mind always that this was a very specific epoch in the whole of Europe. He was definitely a fan, if I can say, he was disciple of Nietzsche. Nietzsche died in 1900 exactly, so he was just born in 1880. His whole lifespan, he didn't last long. He died when he was 50. He died in 1936, which means that he lived for 56 years. He died so a relatively young man. He had heart problems and he had some also anxiety problems and so on. So basically, he's a man, what the French call of the fin du siècle, of the end of the century. A very turning century where we have the compound names such as Marx, Nietzsche, Darwin, Wilfredo Pareto, all those big names coming on the European intellectual horizon and which really, really shaped the entire intellectual climate in Europe in the first half, I must repeat that, in the first half of the 20th century. Without Spengler, you cannot think, you cannot even imagine the different intellectual streams and currents in Europe and in the United States of America. Now, he came from a rather frugal family. His dad was he was an engineer, but he retired later on, and he was born in the Harz, which used to be the East Germany. So he lived a rather peaceful life, and he wasn't politically active. Let me put that way, folks. He was just an intellectual man, a man of staggering erudition in classics, in different languages, and he spent his whole life literally, not metaphorically, reading and studying. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind what happened during this crucial year in 1933. In 1933, he was not a Nazi member, but he did, whether I like it or not. His ideas may have, let me put it conditionally, may have affected some currents in the National Socialist movement, especially in terms of his cultural pessimism, and of course in terms of his sharp criticism, liberal system, and a Marxist system. Now, again, I mentioned earlier that he had a short meeting, an hour and a half meeting with Hitler, despite the fact that he published just a year earlier, this was in 1932, he published his last book, which I think is a good compendium, and I would definitely suggest to most of your listeners to read this book even prior to reading the book on the decline of the West. And this book's name is The Hours of Decision. Again, we have a problem with the title, because the title in the German language is The Years of Decision. And the book was translated The Hours of Decision in the English language. I don't know why, literally. So it's like a short compendium of his earlier works, in which he basically lays out his criticism of liberalism, modernity, progress, and of course, all different mass movements. And despite all of this, I must stress this, despite all of this, many National Socialist circles, including Hitler himself, didn't mind, paying him a visit. And, so I guess it sort of casts a different light on all those stories and narratives that we hear about Hitler, or for that matter, National Socialist and Spengler. He was a scholar, and he was, as I said, he was somewhat sympathetic to Mussolini and to fascism, but this was quite different from his views on National Socialism, which he to some extent despised because of its massification and because of its optimism, which certainly he was opposed to.
Now, let me just ask you, Tom. Have any major biographies been done of Spengler's life? And if so, has anyone? What was sort of the genesis of his world outlook, would you say? Has there been a consensus on that?
Yes, the first. Okay, let me first try to stay value neutral. Okay, we cannot imagine Oswald Spengler without having in mind Friedrich Nietzsche and Goethe. In fact, in his dedication in the first edition of his book, The Decline of the West, He specifically refers in the first page to Goethe, Wolfgang Goethe, a great German poet and dramatist, and Friedrich Nietzsche. So again, we have to situate him. We have to situate Oswald Spengler in the right epoch, in the right time frame. And I guess that did explain very, very much. Just like we cannot imagine many subsequent authors and even his, how can I say, bibliographers who were fond of him, including the American scholar and just a second. It's on the tip of my tongue. It will come. And who definitely had, who were definitely influenced by Nietzsche's prose. So is that the question you asked me? I just wanted to be quite specific. Yes, Nietzsche was the product of the late 19th century, specifically Nietzsche, of German idealism, and of course Spengler in turn influenced great many thinkers, not just in Europe, but also in the United States of America, thinkers who, quote, are usually associated with the word cultural conservatives. Even Pat Buchanan, if you wish, quotes him at some place, Nozick and other authors, and many other conservatives from Chronicles of American Culture I'm familiar with. Well, basically all conservative scholars in the United States of America at some point referred to him, or either by paraphrasing him or citing or quoting directly from his work.
All right. Well, let's take a break and end this segment. When we get back in our next major segment, let's talk about the decline of the West, the major work that he's known for. We'll get to some of his later works in a later segment. But in the next segment, let's focus on the decline of the West, when it was published, the major ideas about cultures, about decay, about cycles in history, etc. And we'll do that in a moment. Well, Tom, I want to focus in this segment on the most notable work, or the most famous work in Spengler's bibliography, and that, of course, is the Untergang, or the Decline of the West. And I wanted to focus a bit on what prompted the book, number one, and then the content, things such as the distinctions that he made between a culture and a civilization, so which was sort of like the becoming and what results from it. His ideas on, I think there were the Apollonian cultures, Faustian cultures, the different types of cultures, and all of that kind of thing that he's most noted for. So let me just ask from the beginning, what prompted him to write this work initially? Was it was it a particular thing that he'd worked on for many years, or is it known as what really gave him the impetus to write a book in this vein?
On the intellectual level, as I mentioned a while ago, Spengler was an avid disciple of Friedrich Nietzsche. And Friedrich Nietzsche, he certainly can be ranked into this category of cultural pessimism as well. And as a result of this, as a result of his avid reading of Nietzsche, he felt compelled, in a way, to sketch out the broader, I'll call it the biology of history, because this is probably the best explanation for his work, the biology of history, in which basically he studies the decline of histories by comparing them to trees, to petals, to different plants, how they grow and how they actually decay. As a result of this biological process of growth and decay and death. So we can notice here right away a strong sense of the tragic, which was quite typical for many, literally hosts of German philosophers or thinkers, starting with Schopenhauer, by the way. For instance, I'm sorry again to back up, but we cannot study Nietzsche unless we study Arthur Schopenhauer and his book, a very pessimistic book about the perception of our reality and how people perceive the reality. So just as Nietzsche was influenced by Schopenhauer, so was Spengler influenced 100 years later, actually after Nietzsche had already died. This was 20 years later. He was influenced by Nietzsche. There was a strange coincidence in that book, and I need to stress that I need to point to that. The book was written. It was already not finished, but it was the major draft had already been written prior to the First World War and during the First World War. The book came out only shortly after the First World War, and the results of the First World War for Germany only corroborate these earlier, let's say, prophecies or wishful thinking, we may say, that the world, and specifically the Western world, the Occident, the Abendland, in German is Abendland, which is not exactly the West. Again, I'm sorry for those digressions, but the West is not the best translation for the German word that's Abendland. Abendland is the land of the dying sun, of the setting sun, like in San Francisco. And this Occident, this trauma that was caused by the end of the First World War, the turmoil in Germany in 1919, in 1920, only gave further credence to his popularity, and he was literally overnight, during the Weimar Republic, he became one of the best, the most read authors in Germany. And this trend continued well into the 20s and 30s and even after the Second World War. Now, this is a thick book, rather than 2 volumes of this book. And yes, indeed, as you mentioned a while ago, he talks about this. He uses the word the morphology of culture, and I think that the word biology of culture would be better, in which he studies, of course, not just the European cultures, but also different cultures, especially from the Middle East. Now, again, just before we proceed, we need again to clarify another word, which is quite important. And in the English language, though, this is often forgotten. This is often skipped over, and I mean specifically the word civilization versus culture. These are 2 opposing and contradictory concepts. They have nothing in common. They have something in common, but not quite. In the United States of America, for that matter in Europe, we now use interchangeably the word culture and civilization as we use them as a synonym. And on many occasions, especially in his book, Decline of the West, he specifically, I have the citation exactly, I don't know exactly the page, but you can look at my website and the piece I published about 25 years ago on the history and decadence, and called Oswald Spengler and the decadence and history and decadence. It was in the Clio journal, so I'm quoting him. I'll try to I'll try to summarize it in somewhat in a rough language. So, culture is basically something organic. It's spirit-oriented, it's soul-oriented. It comes from the heart. It comes from your passion. It comes from your thinking as well. And your ability of putting yourself in different historical perspective and putting yourself and your own culture, your own race, your own ethnicity in perspective. Whereas civilization, and he uses very much the word Americanism when he talks about the civilization. And again, he was not anti-American, but he was quite critical of this mercantile or merchant culture in the United States of America. We'll come to that in a second. He actually associates the civilization with the rise of the mass man, with the rise of what we call now totalitarian system. He didn't use the word totalitarianism, but we can now use it with the totalitarian system. Again, the word system is much better than society. And he actually compares the civilization to anorganic, that's the word he uses now, it's come back to my mind, anorganic life form, which is bound to decline. So if we can transpose now Spengler into our epoch, into our time, into this very present moment when we are talking to each other, we can say safely that we are, according to his words, according to his vocabulary, that we are actually traversing, that we are actually going through this end times of this technical civilization, which has become totally ruthless, totally immoral, totally decadent, totally out of the wall, and which is declining at a very rapid pace, So it's just a matter of time, whether it's years or decades or centuries, before it falls apart. So this is specifically what he means by civilization. He was a great admirer of cultures, specifically cultures, but he also realized that those cultures at some point in time, and now we're talking about past tense, they also ended up in civilization. So basically the civilization, once again, is a mortal enemy of culture. So we have a dual, a very interesting form of, how can I put it in English, of contradictory, two contradictory concepts. You cannot have civilization, according to Spengler, unless you have culture. Yet at the same time, civilization is bound to decline. So yes, indeed, we can probably reproach him, we can tell him, we can accuse him, we can charge him with being a historical determinist, which to a large extent he was, according to many, many authors who wrote about him. Lukács wrote about him, Pat Buchanan mentions that also at some place. Some other authors, I mentioned that in some of my pieces about him. So yes, you can say that he was a inveterate pessimist, in a sense that yes, we need culture. Of course, we need to be all cultivated and cultured, if I can put it somewhat more in a popular fashion for younger listeners. And yet at the same time, we have too much culture. We have the surplus of accumulation of culture. We end up in civilization. And with the civilization, look at the United States of America. We sign literally, not metaphorically, we sign a death warrant. So that's an irony of history, because he also talks about different cultures, just backpedaling, if I can, a little bit, ancient Greece, ancient Babylonian cultures, that all turn into fantastic and famous civilizations. But at some point, this, as he says, the rule of money, this greed, or how can I put it in a more, not in a less colloquial sense, this materialistic accumulation of capital, it's probably not a good word, this obsession with material growth and material wealth turns culture into civilization, and civilization then almost is bound to collapse. Now, the interesting point, and I just need to, because I'm still there, is that he basically argues, and this is where he sounds a little bit too deterministic and probably maybe repulsive to some of our younger listeners, some of the scholars as well, is that all cultures, without any exception, be it the American culture, German culture, French culture, are bound to go through those cycles, which is bound to end up in their self-destruction. Okay, just roughly put.
Well, Tom, let me ask you. You mentioned his idea of sort of a biological of civilization and culture as a biological process. Would you say? Do you think it would be? It's been unfair to say that he was a pessimist, because, as I recall, each sort of flowering and then decay, formed the loam for the next civilization to come. So it seems to me that his idea of the decline of the West, by the nature of his very argument, presaged the coming of a new culture. So that really wouldn't be pessimistic. It's just, at that point in time, and if you're in the West, it might seem pessimistic. So it seems to me, as I recall, that that seems a bit of a bum rap to give him, because he's just sort of looking at it from on high, and he almost had this sort of godlike view, looking back down upon it, with over the centuries. Would that be fair to say that that he was more detached and able to look at it and see this turnover? To call him a pessimist would be unfair.
I fully agree with you, Dan. I must tell you, I myself am frequently puzzled, and hence the reason I don't want to now dish out my own value judgments about him. You are quite right. Look, after all death, after each death, there is a new rebirth, and I guess there is a new birth. There's a new something new springs back to life. Even look at yourself. I mean, we don't need to narrate now about ourselves. Once we die, once we pass out, once we just vanish from the earth, and our descendants, our children, our progeny, our progeniture, our offsprings will take over. And I guess it's a good point that I just need to make a slight digression. This is exactly where National Socialist scholars, I mean official scholars, many of them racially oriented, I happen to be familiar with some of their works, where they actually attacked him on this bum rapping, as you said. How you have a death of life, of course, but there is something new coming up. Again, we can make the following argument, if you allow me. Like I'm sure you hear, especially among many conservatives in the United States of America, I'm talking about cultural conservatives, I'm not talking, about Republicans, so that's a different ballgame. They talk, well, it's the end of the white race, of this, and well, that's fine, but something new will then spring up. Now, here we got to be very careful. Whether this is going this new is going to be better or for worse, I can't tell you. This is a matter of value judgment. The fact of the matter is that I may now, in hindsight, feel some nostalgia for, let's say, the old Greek culture. I may feel some romantic, in hindsight, nostalgia, for Leonidas and his Spartans who fought against the Persians. I may also have some nostalgia, let's say, for, I am particularly a fan of Prince Eugene of the 17th century, who actually cleared up the terrain, who kicked out the Turks of Central Europe, and where I live, Prince Eugene, and with his volunteers from all parts of Europe, he kicked out not just the Muslims, the Turks out of Europe completely. But again, to what extent this nostalgia can square off now with my present wishful thinking, I can't tell you. It's just a matter of philosophical speculation. Whether the United States of America, let me take a wild guess, and I don't want to harp on this, but I need to mention it. Whether America, let's say 20 years or 30 years down the road, when this demographic profile will have changed, will be a better place to live. Well, probably yes for some, but probably not for some other folks. So again, now we are again in this Nietzschean dilemma. What is good and what is bad? It may be good for some people, but it may be bad for some other folks. So you are quite right. He is a cultural pessimist, although I'm quite certain if he was alive now, he would argue with us. He would tell Tom and Dan, no, I'm not a cultural pessimist, I'm just stating the obvious. Yeah. So I guess it's just a matter of wording, and I'm sorry I cannot read his mind. One thing I know for sure, because I read about him, because I guess I feel a certain attracted to him, because I usually read authors that are also close to my own temperament and my own psyche, my own cognition, if I can put it somewhat more eloquently. He was a very anxiety-prone man. He was sort of he was leaning again towards this cultural pessimism, like many of us do. There's no question about it. But his self-description is certainly different from the description of the subsequent critics and authors of him. Wow, I got a little bit entangled in these wordings, but I'm sure you can follow the thread of my thought, and some of your listeners, I hope they can follow me.
Well, Tom, let me just ask you then. Let's talk about his ideas of types of civilization, because he talked about Apollonian, Magian, Faustian civilizations, and I want to talk about that. And since he thought the West was declining, did he have any ideas about what coming civilization might be like? So yes. Let's talk about the three major types of civilizations that he defined and what he thought was coming in the future. So if you could just give a brief definition on those types.
Apollonian civilization, I'm sure folks are familiar with Apollo.
Yeah.
It was one of the prime gods in ancient Greece, in the old mythical Greece, of course. He stood for beauty, we can call it aestheticism. I don't think this word exists. I've seen it in the English language, although it's not being used quite often. He stood for the form, for the Gestalt, what the Germans say, for certainly something completely different from decadence, from a formless and abstract society in which we live today. And of course, Spengler, just like Nietzsche talks about the Apollonian culture, the Dionysian culture very much. Again, keep in mind, if you read Spengler, guys, please take a book by Nietzsche as well and read The Birth of the Tragedy by Nietzsche, because it's a valuable secondary book in order to refurbish your knowledge of Spengler. I hate to say that, folks, but you can't just read Spengler out of the context. You got to put him in the right. Excuse me, I got this cough. You have to put him in the right context, folks, if you want to understand him. He's definitely Nietzsche #2. That's what Spengler was all about. So Apollonian culture was a culture of beauty, a culture of nicety, culture of forms, which of course is completely opposed to our modern culture, which is not even a culture, which is a decadent civilization. Then we have a Dionysian culture. Of course, Dionysian culture is something very interesting, and we'll find it all over among Greek classics, folks. It's something inseparable from the Greek life. Again, I hate to use the word cultural pessimism when describing, let's say, Sophocles or for Aeschylus or other classical Greek authors. I would say that there were people who had a very pronounced sense of the tragic. And of course, they knew that they were going to die, they knew that they were going to vanish, but at the same time, they also cherished their life. They were not cultural pessimists, as some suicidal authors would probably suggest. They enjoyed life almost sometimes to their extreme, and this is what we call the Dionysian culture. Nietzsche explains it very well, just like Spengler, in a sense that you have to wine and dine, if I can put it that way. I mean, we have those Dionysian celebrities and celebrations all over Greece, in ancient Greece, in the 4th, 5th century before Jesus Christ. And of course, the only problem is with the bounds of those Dionysian cultures. Once they get off the board, then they become self-destructive, of course. And then what's certainly of the greatest interest for all of us is this Faustian culture, which he spends most of the time talking about, which is basically the Western culture, the Faustian culture. We can possibly also call it the Promethean culture, because I often, in my own works, in my own essays, including the last one, the latest one that I published recently, I often compare Faust with Prometheus. Prometheus, as you certainly know, was a titan. He was not a god. He's ranked as a god in ancient literature. He was a man, or actually a titan, a deity, who had given fire to the mankind, who actually created the man and mankind. But he was such a dissident, he was such a heretic, so he got into a brawl. He got into a fight with Zeus, with the big god, if I can put it somewhat simplistically. And for that, he had to pay the price. So he was not a very politically correct god or titan during that time. But he was a man of exceptional driving, how can I say, energy. And this is something very, very typical, and I need to specify, this is very typical of European peoples. Now we can say white race, this hyper-individualism, hyper knowledge, and always striving to surpass himself. And unfortunately, we know when we want to surpass ourselves, sometimes things can get very nasty, not just for the others, but also for ourselves. And this is the problem also we encounter with the Faustian culture. I use interchangeably, in my own wording at least, Faust and Prometheus, Faustian culture and Promethean culture. Again, let's return to the definition of the word Faust. Faust, folks, I'm sure you're familiar with. I mentioned a while ago that Spengler was influenced by Nietzsche and by Schopenhauer, but he was also influenced by one of probably the greatest European author, Wolfgang Goethe, who wrote his book, a very good translation in English, on Faust. The Faust was a young man, a man who literally, who had read so many books, but he's always unhappy. He has everything in his life. Whatever he can think of, he has. But he's unhappy because he would like to reach the unreachable. This is the prime example of the Faustian or Promethean culture. And this is something very typical. I hate to say that this is not an ethnic, but yes, we can say an ethnic quality, or rather disquality of European peoples. We always want to reach ourselves. Here's the best example on a geopolitical level, if I may, guys, just throw this at you, of a Faustian spirit. Young, let's say, Englishmen or young Scots or young Irish, let's say, in the 17th, 18th century, and traveling all the way down to Tasmania or traveling all the way down to Utah. Can you imagine? Those folks didn't even know where they were going. They were just going because they had this spirit of conquest, the spirit of Promethean spirit of surpassing themselves. We no longer have this spirit, folks. It's over. So this is exactly what Spengler says in his culture. Real energy that we find among most European people, especially among the English and the German people as well, although he makes a difference between the English people and the Germanic people. Just as much as it can be a good fuel for intellectual energy, for our scientific energy, can also turn into our deadly, the mirror image of our deadly embrace. Look at the atomic weapons, look what's going on in Europe, look what's going on along the world, specifically among European peoples, who are the worst enemies towards themselves, not towards other peoples. And also Spengler talks about this. So I must say that on a personal level, folks, just as much as I'm often categorized as a right-winger, whatever that means, some of the worst enemies I have are my own people, I must tell you that. Precisely because of this Promethean or false Promethean energy that fuels, that energizes those people and sometimes makes them adopt strategies which are detrimental not just to other peoples, but also to themselves. Again, just to sum up, Faustian and Promethean is more or less the synonym for this, how can I put it more descriptively? For this energy-driven culture, which is very typical, which is a hallmark of Europeans, of white Europeans.
Well, Tom, let me ask you then, what was the basic surmise? How did Spengler end his book, and what was his basic thesis and prescription going forward? And did he have a view of what a coming civilization that would rise from the ashes of the West might be?
Yes, well, actually, he expands on that a little bit more in his latest book. Actually, as far as the Untergang des Abendlandes, as far as the decline of the West is concerned, it's a rather pessimistic work. And he's very pessimistic about the future of the West. And there's nothing, there's no hope, there's no glimmer of hope in this book. However, in his later work, in this latest book, he may sound a little bit contradictory because he specifically mentions in some parts of this book the years of decision. Oh, I'm sorry, the hours of decision. That life is a fight. Yes, so I'll try to. Folk, don't misquote me, and I hope I'm not going to misquote him. Life is a permanent battle, roughly. Yes, life is a permanent battle. And whoever cedes, whoever gives up, will be overrun by lower forms of life. I don't want to say that he was a racist because he never mentions he never uses racial slurs in his books. Far from it, folks. But he is definitely aware of the fact that if whites, where he talks specifically about whites, and he's quite critical of white pacifists, and talking to. So this is the book, keep in mind, was published just a year before the National Socialists came to power, but which was not banned. The book was not banned during the National Socialist period of time. And in his book, he says quite openly, if you give up, if you think that you're going to disarm your opponents by pacifistic preaching, you will certainly not disarm them. Quite to the contrary, you will spur them into attacking you and robbing you and raping you and taking over. I guess to some extent we can say he's right, because this is on a personal level where I disagree with many pacifists who argue, well, let's just have a unilateral disarmament, let's just bail out of, let's just pull out troops from Nicaragua, where I'm at, I'm still in the Spenglerian time, from Afghanistan, or pull out the troops of where Philippines or Europe, whatever, and peace will prevail. No way, folks. It doesn't work, and this is exactly what Spengler argues throughout this whole book. You give up with your pious preaching, it will certainly not be a guarantee of success. It will be taken over, he says quite explicitly in his book, and the last one that I already mentioned, The Hours of Decision, where he talks about non-white upheavals, white upheavals and non-white upheavals, where he talks about the demographic increase in among non-European peoples, and the demographic decrease of European peoples and their imminent obituary, self-obituary, so to say. But he does argue at some point that this is where he's, I don't quote in front of me, given I might probably need some time to find it on my website, where he actually talks, no, life is a fight. I'm not a pessimist, he says in a somewhat apologetic way. I'm not a pessimist, I keep fighting. Life is a struggle. And so he may sound a little bit more inspiring in his last book than in these two first volumes of The Decline of the West. So again, be careful when you describe him as a cultural pessimist. Well, he is in books, in manuals, he described as cultural pessimist, but at the same time, he was a man full of energy, very, very Dionysian at some time. He liked smoking cigarettes as well, and anyway, he liked drinking.
Well, Tom, it sounds like he actually was quite prophetic in describing the post-colonialism that came after the Second World War in India, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, as well as the civil rights movement in America. Do you think that if Spengler, was alive today, if he had lived 130 years or something, do you think that do you think in some sense that a lot of his ideas have been vindicated, at least as delineated in The Decline?
Dan, did you say pathetic or did you say prophetic?
Prophetic.
Oh, sorry. Okay, it's a big difference though. Thanks. No, I understand perfectly. Well, you're reading my mind. Hence the need. This is not some of my wishful thinking or some of my Masonic whim to talk about Spain. I hate to use the word prophecy and self-fulfilling prophecies because this has become a standard word now among many of our American politicians, Croatian politicians, you name it, who all think that they have some visionary, wind, and that they can change the world. I don't believe in it. But I would certainly very mildly use the word visionary, and as far as Spengler is concerned. Hence the need, folks, indeed, the need to read the book. It's a short one. It has 100 pages. Read the book, The Hours of Decision. It's a short one. It will give you the synopsis of his first book, which is quite complicated, which has many, many footnotes where he talks about different religions, Catholicism, Islam, and talk about the decline of the West. It's a thick book. It needs time. And the book is interesting, the last one, because it's quite prophetic, right? Quite visionary in the sense that he talked in the last chapter of it. He talks about this non-white revolution. I'm not sure he uses the word revolution itself, but he does talk about this as the people, energetic people. He doesn't make any value judgment, quite to the contrary. He doesn't make any statements whether this is good or bad, but he simply says that the West is it's over because. And okay, folks, let me just back up a little bit. I know this is on the tip of our tongue, and we don't want to say the word race, but we need to say that. Now, this is where Spengler differed from many of the contemporary racialist thinkers in Germany, not just in National Socialist Germany, but even earlier to that. He was not a determinist, a racial determinist. He uses the word race, but he uses it in a broader sense, not in a biological sense only. He uses it all. He distinguishes quite explicitly, folks, between strong races and weak races. But he doesn't say that the whites are any better than the blacks, or for that matter, Asians, or what have you. So he was certainly not a racialist. He was certainly not a man who preached racial exclusion. Far from it. But still, he is aware of the fact that, and this is one of the reasons why he was to some extent sidestepped and removed from the cultural strivings of early National Socialist regime, because he did not quite accept his racial determinism anyway. It's a long story. But at the same time, he is aware, as a cultural pessimist, as somebody who doesn't have a very rosy picture of the glorious West, or the future of this glorious West, that due to their number, and due to the self-hate, yes, this is something also quite important in the book, which he mentions. I'm not sure he uses in the German language the word self-hate, but he talks about this pacifism. He talks about this guilt-ridden West. That's a good line and good parallel we can draw with the United States of America and with the West now, with the guilt-ridden pessimism resulting in, well, folks, we all equal. And he was a strong opponent of equality, folks. He was definitely a strong opponent of Marxism and of liberalism. And he actually argues that once you start with those pontificating trip feelings, then you are certainly ceding the terrain to stronger races, to more dynamic races which will take over, and then at some point they will start rewriting the history. This is the main theme in this book, in both his books, but very well summarized, particularly in the last chapter of this book, The Hours of Decision, which again, I don't think it was very well translated. It should have been the title in German is The Years of Decision, but it's okay, it's so fine.
Well,
I got lost. I hope I'm not bothering you. And
no,
am I losing you? Or am I whatever?
no,
I
that's
hope I'm
fine.
not.
Let's end this segment, and in our next segment we'll pick up the threads, and I want to talk about the critical reception of both The Decline and his other works, how Spengler has been viewed throughout the last 100 or so years, and what his lasting legacy is, and we'll do that when we return. In this segment, Tom, I'd like to talk about uh, the legacy of Spengler, both his works, his death, and then in the last almost 8 decades since his death, how he has been viewed by critics, both pro and con, and how these things may have changed over the decades and what may be to come. So, like you said, the book came out shortly after the First World War. How was it initially received in Europe and in other parts of the world?
In Germany, they had a very positive. It became a standard reading for what came to be known later on cultural conservatives or young conservatives or nationalist conservatives in Germany. So usually, also Spengler's name is in the same category with novelist Ernst Jünger, who was also his colleague, and whose novels also have an imprint of Spenglerian whiff of this end of the cultures, end of civilizations. Also, why do I mention the works of cultural conservatives in Germany? What they used to say, cultural revolution, cultural conservative revolution in Germany, which definitely had a certain impact 10 years later on the rise of national socialism in terms of intellectual legitimacy. And yes, so we cannot decouple the name of Oswald Spengler from the names of other uh, quote unquote, why do I use the word quote? Because it's today totally meaningless to say the word conservative. I don't know what it means. What does it mean, conservative? But at that time, yes, it was. Spengler's name was in the group, within the group of people like Ernst Jünger, the novelist, Carl Schmitt, the legal scholar, big legal scholar, very much translated now in English language all over the world. And then, of course, many other. Nietzsche was, of course, was a standard book that for all conservatives and many nationalists. There's no question about that. Now, again, one thing we need to mention is that his book in French, to my knowledge, well, you really got me on that. I think it was translated in the late 20s in the French language. And it did have some impact over there. Now, keep in mind that Oswald Spengler, in his book, the first book, The Decline of the West, quotes many similar, if I can say, similar French authors and scholars, sociologists, and so the French were not that far behind. But he had definitely, the final word I need to say, he had definitely had a strong impact on the legacy of cultural conservatism, both in the United States of America. I'm talking prior to the Second World War, and in the United States of America. Yes, in the United States, he was translated, I think, 26 and 27, and the translation is very good. I can't tell, there are a couple of different translators. Now, one thing, of course, with the Second World War and with the aftermath of the Second World War, folks, I'm sure you know what happened, and let's be perfectly frank and open about Spengler and his legacy. Or for that matter, not just Spengler and his legacy, but other similar authors, probably not of the same caliber, but of the similar caliber, both in France, in the United States of America, or for that matter, in Germany and elsewhere. Now, as far as other Spenglers are concerned, Yockey, yes, Yockey is the first name that comes to my mind. I'm sure you read Yockey. He's an American young lawyer who was at this Nuremberg trial, who died. I don't know, who knows how. I'm not quite certain about all those intricacies about his death. But his book on the Imperium, yes, in English, was very much influenced by the Spenglerian legacy. Then he had an impact on many conservative scholars that I already mentioned in the 50s and the 60s in the United States of America. But, and here's a big but, precisely because of, I can say, guys, and I hope I'm not sounding too biased, because of this leftist or left-leaning Marxian cultural hegemony sweeping over higher education, not just in Europe, but the United States of America, in the aftermath of the Second War. So this is like it was not a war, but it was a different intellectual war. It was to be expected that a name of Spengler would be somewhat eclipsed and overshadowed by other authors. Authors who became popular at Berkeley or Columbia, or for that matter, even where I studied in Santa Barbara, UC Santa Barbara, back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, were certainly not Spengler and his likes, but rather Frankfurt teachers, scholars, Adorno, Horkheimer, and what have you. So we are having a gradual shift in what we call, I hate this foreign word, paradigms, but that's exactly what happened. Students, including some of yourselves folks who are now listening to me, were bombarded, literally, not metaphorically, by Nozick, by Hannah Arendt, by authors Raymond Aron to some extent, in political science and sociology, in psychology as well, in psychoanalysis. Whereas the name of Spengler, he was not banned, far from it. No, certainly not in the United States of America. He was not even banned in Germany after the Second War, unlike hundreds of other scholars whose books were still not available in Germany, and whose books, even if you disseminate them openly, constitute a crime, an offense, a felony. You can't do that. You know, Germany doesn't have a First Amendment. You know, you've got to be careful what you say and how you say and which authors you quote. But it's a different ballgame. We can talk some other time about this. So be it as it may, far from it that Spengler was forgotten. He was like a home, how can I say him, like a Larry or Pinaris, what do you call it? Like a home ghost, like a lively little home ghost protecting the household of every conservative scholar, every conservative man, or even culturally pessimistic man inclined towards those speculation about the end of the West. And his name is, everybody knows his name. Even those people who never read him, they know his name. He has a very nice style, there's no question. No dangling sentences, so I would suggest to you definitely to read him. He's a very prolific author, and he doesn't want to fool you with some locutions and some words that would be hard to grasp, unlike many conservative authors. So yes, he did not disappear, but he was not simply on the reading list. He was not in the syllabus of American and European students, grad students in the history department, and sociology department, and philosophy department. Even nowadays, if you go to any the University of Texas in Austin, for instance, Dan can tell us about this. I'm pretty much sure if you talk to professors, they might probably mention his name every once in a while, but there is hardly a course, let's say a winter course or summer course, or let's say a shortened, abbreviated course dealing with the Spengler, the meaning of Spengler for our modernity and post-modernity, something also important. So yes, I feel to some extent sore, because I don't like this type of a selective, politically correct type of a reading list, which unfortunately we have all over Europe and in the United States of America. I'm sorry about the last portion of your question. I sort of got off the rail a little bit, so I sidetracked. So if you want to remind me about the second portion of your question, I would be grateful.
Yeah, well, I wanted to ask about over the last 80 years since his death, how he's been received. But it came to mind, and for those people listening to the show, initially I had wanted to do a show about historians, and I wanted to do about Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, Spengler, and later Daniel J. Boston. But I was just looking up, and another name came to me as someone who may have written his work in direct response to Spengler. And would you think that Arnold Toynbee's study of history was influenced by Spengler? And if so,
Absolutely. I'm glad that you have pointed this out. I must tell you, I read only sparsely some portions of Toynbee because probably I'm biased, too much biased towards Spengler. But yes, you cannot even imagine, I dare say this, you cannot imagine Toynbee without Spengler's legacy. Because even if chronologically, if you look at the time span, one comes after the other. So there's no question that Toynbee in his also work uses some of the, probably even better so, than Spengler. Now, again, you mentioned Gibbon. There's no question, even Gibbon is mentioned on several occasions in Spengler's book. So Gibbon is still considered as a prime author in studying those cycles of history, which again, folks, is not purely a Spenglerian phenomenon. This cyclical concept of history, and I've been dealing with that for quite some time, both from the historical and also philosophical and religious perspective, this is something which is part and parcel of our ancient pre-Christian legacy. You know, in ancient Europe, you know, for that matter, look at the ancient Greeks and ancient Romans, and this is where I'm fully in agreement with Spengler, who was not a Christian. Of course, he was raised Christian, but he was not a Christian in a theological sense. He was a Nietzschean. He believed, and I guess I should have said that at the very beginning, he believed in this cyclical concept of history, namely, cultures grow, they become decadent, they disappear, but it's not the end of history. There's no such thing as a Huntington, I'm sorry, what is this Japanese fellow, what at the end of history who wrote,
Fukushima.
Yes, yes, there is no such thing. Utterings, he would consider that a crime, an offense, an academic offense, even talking about the end of history. So yes, this is where Spengler, and not just Spengler, but Gibbon and Toynbee, and along with many authors of the ancient, old Greek times, ancient Hellenic times, and including many cultural conservatives in contemporary Europe and the United States, fully agree with, namely, that there is no such thing as the end of history. History has a certain chapter, it comes to an end, and Spengler is quite explicit about that. I should have probably used some different metaphors in explaining this more succinctly. And even if, let's say, hypothetically speaking, if the whites, even if they all disappear from the map, or from the land, from the earth, it doesn't mean it's going to be the end of life. It's just the beginning of a different cycle of history. And I guess to this extent, we must, again, praise, if I can put it that way, the Spengler and his definite inroads in the study of the philosophy of history. Now, again, folks, you know, I mentioned earlier that we got to be careful about the right usage of locutions. Spengler is not a historian. He's not recording history. He's not descriptive in his historical accounts. Yes, to some extent he is, but he's basically a philosopher of history. So I would definitely describe him first and foremost as a philosopher before I describe him as a historian. And yes, I'm not ruling out that he may again gain in credibility or in popularity in the years to come, depending again on who is going to be doing the PR and the footwork on his behalf and who's going to be preventing those things. Now, I know that there are a couple of racialists and a couple of white nationalists, whatever they call themselves, who may be a little bit offended by his not explicit statement of white race as the main standard barrier of let's say, progress or something. But again, you'd be surprised he doesn't laud, or for that it doesn't matter, he doesn't raise to the skies neither race. And he's, I must say, he's very neutral and very objective in this sense. What we need to say, however, why I like personally, on a personal level, why I like Spengler, because he's very critical not just of Bolshevism and communism, but he's also critical of liberalism. And one thing, yes, Dan, I forget the main thing, the most important thread in our Spenglerian discussion. And this is what? The criticism, sharp, immense criticism of progress. This is Fortschritt. In German language, it's the Fortschritt. He hated Fortschritt. The concept, this philosophical concept of Fortschritt, being associated with Marxism and Leninism and liberalism nowadays, of course, and we constantly talk about more income, more wealth, more greed. This he actually rejects it wholeheartedly. It doesn't exist for him. This is the main, and the major uh, vector of decadence and of self-destruction, fortune. And I'm glad, yes, we can draw the parallel with Christopher Lasch. Yes, he's definitely Spenglerian. Read Christopher Lasch, he's a great American. Well, he died just like Spengler. He was 56 or 57. I don't think he died in 94. Christopher Lasch, great American scholar of German ancestry. He wrote some very visionary, path-breaking books about this culture of narcissism, very pessimistic books, very much influenced by Spengler. I can tell you that for sure. I think he mentions him on several occasions, but you can see definitely this the width of Spengler in all of his books.
Well, Tom,
Yes, he actually rejects fortune as progress, the ideology of progress.
Well, when you say the ideology of progress, you're talking about in terms of comparative cultural superiority, aren't you? I mean, obviously he accepted that science would advance, and I mean, if he had seen Neil Armstrong walk on the moon, or our flyby with a satellite near the planet Pluto recently, I mean, certainly he would note that as progress. What you're really talking is about culturally comparative progress. Is that not correct?
Yes, well, I'm glad that you brought this up because this is something very important. I myself, just like Christopher Lasch, or let's say like Spengler, I'm definitely against this ideology of progress. Having said this, folks, it doesn't mean that we have to return to the trees and we have to use the closets, the restrooms, like I don't know, like people in some parts of whatever, in Saudi Arabia or wherever, or in Africa. I'm certainly not opposed to the helicopters and to choppers and to different electronic devices coming to on the material progress. It's just the ideology of progress which actually overwhelms our spiritual endeavors, our intellectual endeavors. And actually, he traces Spengler. He traces this destructive ideology of progress back to the Enlightenment, which had its good sides both in the United States of America and France, but which also had its very ugly sides. Namely, it has made people believe. It actually turned into a religion. The religion, we can better say it somewhat sarcastically, it's a religion of progress. When you believe that everything can be solved by a stroke of the pen by a guy from, let's say, the European Commission or by Oval Office, and that some whatever current economic crisis can be subdued by some gurus from the Wall Street. This is the ideology of progress. And this is the false assumption, a very dangerous assumption. And this is why we need to return, and here I'm a good advocate for Spengler, that's why we need to return to Spenglerian vision of this cyclical history. Because once we accept this quote-unquote cultural pessimism, once we accept this idea, this phenomenon that we are all just, transitory beings here, it's something we need to leave something after us. There's no question of it, not just consume. Then, of course, this will help us subdue pessimism or civil wars or impending chaos. And this is exactly what Spengler says in a more explicit manner. So I guess I'm trying just to compound and synthesize as much as I can Spengler. But he's not the only one. Many, especially many what I call conservative cultural conservatives are opposed to this phenomenon, this religion of progress, whereby we all assume, especially now media, that there is a magic wand that will be discovered next year in the Oval Office or somewhere, who knows, in the Fed, and that whatever quantitative easing will be able to facilitate our how can I say, our transition to a glorious future, glorious society where everybody will be happy and where everybody will enjoy 24 hours fun. This is something where I'm fully in agreement with Spengler. Namely, folks, what we have now, the food that I have on the table, the money that I have on the table, or whatever, it certainly can collapse any minute, and we have to be prepared for that. This is the main line of Oswald Spengler.
He was against false utopianism then.
Absolutely. That's even a better word. He was against utopianism. In other words, the utopianism, be it in its Marxist modality, or call it the Bolshevik modality, we know how it ended up in 91, and now we see the liberal modality. And he was, by the by, folks, he is very, very critical of America, not just per se, not as such America, but as the American ruling elites, ruling class of the United States of America, and he was very, very critical of liberalism, capitalism. He uses the word plutocracy quite often. Plutocracy, money, greed, and he talks, I mean, very, very, I think hundreds of times at least he uses in his books plutocracy. It was a very popular term in Europe in the 30s, plutocracy, you know, the rule of the rich. And
Yeah. Well, Tom, let me ask, as we were recording this interview, it's the year 2015, so who knows, 5, 10 years from now, if someone's watching it, it's been almost 80 years, 8 decades since the death of Spengler. If we project outwards in another 80 years, can you tell me where academic or cultural ideas about Spengler are now, and where you think they may be as we head towards the end of the 21st century?
Well, I guess there are two things we need to single out. In his latest book that I mentioned already, The Hours of Decision, he talks about this non-white revolution. So your question, to a large extent, depends on the following answer. We'll have the answer, the clear-cut answer, more or less, or at least the visible answer, based on the social and ethnic profile of the United States of America and Europe in the 10 years down the road. I'm sure you're aware of the fact, and Spengler wasn't aware of that, because there's always this unpredictable factor in history. He wasn't aware of the fact when he died in 36 that first that Germany was going to end up in a chaotic, self-destructive war, and secondly that 30 years, or rather 50 years after his death, that million non-European residents and peoples, and its social and demographic fabric is changing on the daily basis. So again, 10 years down the road, I don't know where I'm going to be sitting at. I don't know how my judgments will be and on Spengler and his prophecies, on his visions. But I suspect that if Spengler was alive nowadays, that he would be extremely concerned with the ultimate decadence of the West. And again, look, let me tell you one thing, and on an ethnocentric level, if I may. I think I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but we have to say that it's a different ballgame when let's say, a white scholar, or let's say a German scholar, defines Spengler than, let's say, a non-white scholar. So I'm pretty much sure there may be some differences in objective value, in objective assessment of Spengler's work. Because the perspectives, and this is, by the by, folks, also quite important, because Spengler doesn't talk about the global history as such. He talks about those micro-histories. He says, yes, the decline of the West shows that, as the French said, it's obituary, it's final. But it doesn't mean that some other cultures, like specifically the Chinese culture, may be springing up maybe in the wings in the years and the decades to come, which I'm quite certain of. This may be the case with the world, with the planet in 10 years down the road, with the Chinese. But again, where I may disagree, and I'm happy about this, with Spengler, and where I may sound a little bit optimistic, and where I'm in agreement with some other historians, some good friends and colleagues of mine, namely, is that there's always the unpredictable factor in history. I know it firsthand. In 1990, nobody could have predicted the breakdown of communism in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, which I witnessed firsthand. And nobody could have predicted 10 years ago that the fall of Saddam or whatever, Libyan Gaddafi. But folks, if I now start speculating about what's going to be in Europe, what's going to be in America 10 years down the road, I guess I don't want to sound too far-fetched and probably too crazy. So I guess I do have some ideas. I'm not very optimistic about the United States of America and the future of growth, what they call it, and religion of growth in the United States of America. So I hate to end up on this tone and on this level, folks, but I can definitely suggest you please do read Spengler. If you don't like all of his stuff, at least read some chapters that may be more digestible for you. One thing I can for sure tell you, his lingo, his syntax is quite simple, so you won't have a hard time with it. A couple of foreign words that you may become familiar with, because now we use the word totalitarianism, which was not a word in the 30s, was not in usage. He uses the word Caesarism for authoritarian dictatorships, which he was quite in favor of, depending on the country. Again, he was quite in favor of Mussolini, rise to power to some extent. Strong men are sometimes needed in order to prevent the chaos. And there are words, but most of the words are well translated into English, so I don't think you'll have some hard time, unless you guys you're really crazy about semantic levels as I am. But I'm glad that we have covered a little bit Spengler, and I hope we'll have some more Spenglerians. Yes, on the conservative horizon, there are lots of conservatives in America, young conservatives, who quote him quite often in a self-serving fashion. Well, that's always the case, and I hope he will. I hope he will become a mainstream reading on the college level.
Well, Tom, let's end this segment, and when we get back, let's wrap up the interview. I want to talk a little bit about a couple of other things that you had sent me, and also give you a final say. So we'll do that in a moment. Well, I want to wrap up this interview and give Tom a few minutes to just summarize some of his views. But before we do that, a few weeks back, Tom, you had sent me an email from a website or a paper called the Occidental Observer, an article called "The Surveillance Society and Freedom Curbing Legislation Are Nothing New." And in looking over it, it has a lot to do with certainly what's happened in America post 9/11. What are your views about that, and how does it relate to Spengler?
Well, first about the Occidental Observer, I frequently write and I submit my pieces for the Occidental Observer, and his editor-in-chief is Professor Kevin MacDonald. I'm sure folks are familiar with his name. He's world known, he's been translated in different languages, and I usually translate some pieces by my good colleague, Alain de Benoit. By the by, Alain de Benoit is one of the most prominent Spenglerian philosophers, under quotation marks, of course. He's not obsessed with Spengler, he's not deterministic in all ways like Spengler was, but Alain de Benoit certainly knows all nooks and crannies about Spengler, probably better than I do. He has written extensively about Spengler, heavily footnoted books, so you may want to look at his books and his prose. Now, as far as the specific piece is concerned on the surveillance society, this is also a theme that I've been dealing with for quite some time, and this is an interview Alain de Benoit gave in French to a journal recently, and I translated it into English, as I often do for the Occidental Observer with some other of his pieces. What is the main theme, folks? Well, we are being under surveillance. It's no big deal. We know that for sure. With radar cameras, or radars, or the cameras on every street corner, or for that matter, this hidden cameras that you don't. Sometimes I get a little bit embarrassed because even when I use the public restrooms, you never know if somebody is not just listening to you but watching you, which is maybe even more serious than that. Anyway, and. I guess why is this piece important and why is this theme important, folks? Because we sort of grew up with Orwell and with this freedom surveying, with this surveillance society as described by George Orwell and a Big Brother. But again, we have long surpassed this Orwellian type of imagery. We are now in a system which is far more intrusive and I frankly, I can take a wild guess, but even when I'm now talking to you, I'm not that paranoid. But I guess if somebody is really interested in hearing what I have to say, is that you can always find it out. And I like this expression by Alain de Benoit, which I translated into English. The ruling class doesn't want to the people often, I'm just trying to paraphrase, the people often complain how they are not being heard. Well, at least they are being listened to. So I guess that's a good pun that Alain de Benoit makes in his piece that I translated. So yes, folks, it does remind me to some extent of the communist system in which I lived. And again, I would, from my perspective, I'm not so much concerned with the surveillance systems. I guess, America still, despite, some different laws that have passed recently, still has the First Amendment. In many instances, it still has a margin of maneuvering, intellectual maneuvering, of course, more than any other country on earth. However, what I'm concerned with, and this brings me again to the Spenglerian category, folks, is self-surveillance, is self-censorship, particularly in academia. I don't want to sound too pamphletic now, or too, how do I say, too pathetic. It's too pathetic and too subjective. But yes, one of the reasons I'm here, one of the reasons I'm frustrated is because of this self-serving and also self-censoring environment in American and in European academia, where people are far more concerned with their pension funds than in conveying or right, decent messages and knowledge to the people that they've been entrusted with, the young students. And I guess this is what I consider really a major intellectual crime. That folks, especially professors, academics, who instead of serving as role models, as good examples for the society, have become so scared to the extent that they write things just because they're well paid. I mean, it just doesn't only apply to academics, it applies to politicians. But then again, this brings us into an entirely different realm of analysis, which I hope one of these days I'll be able to talk about with Dan in more detail.
Yeah, I agree with you. I'm involved in the arts and have been so for 30 years in the U.S. And I've always been critical of academia, especially in the arts. The old saying that those who can and do, the can and teach is especially applicable in the arts. And you have to go to college to learn to be an ethical or moral citizen. Well, you don't go to a university to learn to be moral. You go to a university to debate ethics. If you have to rely on a professor to teach you what's right and wrong, you're missing the whole point. There's too much of a focus on people's emotions and feelings rather than their intellect. Because to me, what defines us as human beings, as opposed to ape-like ancestors, is that we have minds. It's not our emotions. I'm a pet lover. I've had cats for many years. My cats can feel love, but they can't cogitate. And so I agree with that. That there's been a diminution in West European and America especially of the intellectual content and actually debating things. Too often, when you get people with opposing points of view, someone takes offense very easily, and they use that emotional offense as a weapon in the argument. So I think I'm in agreement with your and your colleagues' point of view. But let me just end up. Let's end up. Let you just give you a couple, 2, 3, 4 minutes, whatever you want. If you just want a summary statement about Spengler or his views or anything.
Yes, in terms of methodology, folks, I don't know if this is the right word because it's being used so often to the extent that it's become meaningless. But okay, let's, in terms of academic approach, in terms of scholarly approach, in terms of, let's say, just educational approach, a simple word. I think, folks, when you study Spengler, please, as I mentioned earlier, try to find a author of a similar background, of a similar approach and a similar content. It will facilitate you the reading and the understanding of Spengler himself, and at the same time, it will facilitate you understanding the broader perspective. I love using the word perspective. I always like to put myself in perspective, not just the people and my interlocutors like Dan I'm talking to. I'm also trying to observe myself with his eyes, and this is why Spengler can be also helpful to you, not just by reading him what's the right word, single-handedly, in a separate fashion, in an extrapolated fashion. Try to lump him. Yeah, it's a good lump him together with similar authors. And yes, again, if I can be of any assistants, do write to me. I wrote a piece on Spengler, Culture and Decadence in Spengler. I almost forgot the title, in a rather prestigious journal, Clio, in 1994, or 1991. Oh, wow. I was a professor at Cal State Fullerton back then. So that piece was published. It's very well, it has a solid bibliography in German, English, and French on quoting many Spenglerians. And I guess this morning I was rereading the piece of mine after so many years, and I don't think I disagree with anything that I previously said. I would probably sound a little bit even more pessimistic than before, because the actual situation nowadays in Europe, but also in the States, especially with the rise of the masses and the minds of them, I don't blame them. Far from it that I blame those newcomers coming from different parts of the world. I rather blame the plutocratic elites and the capitalist elites that enable, with our false preaching about equality, about the quick success, about the becoming very rich in Germany or in Austria and Croatia overnight. Of course, those poor guys who come from Somalia, Ethiopia, and from Algeria, what do you expect them to think about? They think really that they can have just nice chicks around and they'll strike it rich overnight. So the local white elites, corrupted elites, again, that Spengler was writing about, the plutocrats, they're the ones who actually bear the blame. They're the ones who actually are responsible for this chaotic situation in Europe and the United States of America. I'm using those words, I'm lumping them together because once upon a time you could tell the difference between Europe and the States, but now in terms of societal, politics, economy, you name it, guys, arts, everything, I really can't tell the difference. There are portions of Zagreb where I live right now, and literally you can't tell the difference between, let's say, Anaheim, or let's say some parts in Cleveland or Zagreb. Of course, there's a nice cathedral, and people, of course, we can say it's more European, definitely, but in the sense that in terms of demographic profile, but this fun society, this consumer society, this obsession with greed, this self-serving, this lingo, this particularly, what do you call it, this lingo in the media, it reminds me very much of the lingo of US or European scribes or would-be journalists or academics. So yes, I'm quite disappointed with the intellectual environment, both in Europe and the United States of America.
Well, thanks for your time, Tom, in talking so in depth about the life and career and legacy of Oswald Spengler, one of the bigger name and I think one of the more interesting historians of the past. For those who have enjoyed my conversation with Tom Sunic, you can look below this video and you will see a link to his own website, tomsunic.com, if you want to have any more information about his writings or if you want to contact him. And in the next couple of weeks, I will be having a show on the history of certain comic books. And then after that, I will be talking with 4 people who have alternate ideas about the history and the start of the universe. So that's a bit of a switch from what we have today. But again, Tom, thank you for your time.
Thank you.